Chapter 1. Before Ireland was Ireland. Before Ireland had a name, before it was cloaked in green myths and rebel songs, before it raised saints or suffered sieges, it was simply land and sky and stone, a wild island on the edge of the known world shaped by the wind and carved by glaciers. The sea whispered secrets to its jagged shores. Rain softened its soil. And into that silent canvas, long before written words or royal lines, came people. Cautious at first, carrying fire, hunger, and memory. The earliest footprints are faint. Sometime after the glaciers receded, around 10,000 years ago, small bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers crossed into Ireland, perhaps on skinboats or makeshift rafts from Scotland. What drove them is lost: a changing climate, the pursuit of food, or simply the same ancient curiosity that pulls humans over every horizon. They brought with them stone tools, bone needles, flint blades, and a deep reliance on rivers and coastlines. They fished the salmon-filled rivers and stalked wild boar through the forests of oak and elm. They knew nothing of kingdoms or gods, only seasons, survival, and the slow rhythm of a world untouched by conquest. But these first people were not merely animals in skins. They built campsites and left behind microliths, tiny, sharpened stones used for hunting. At places like Mount Sandel in modern-day Northern Ireland, archaeologists have found traces of their fires and feasts, the quiet remnants of lives lived in communion with the land. They didn't yet raise monuments, they didn't yet bury their dead with ceremony, but they began something, a presence that would never leave the island. Then came a shift. Around 4000 BCE, the Neolithic age arrived, not suddenly, not in war or fire, but like the slow bloom of a new language. These were farmers, not just hunters. They brought cattle, wheat, barley. They cleared forests, fenced fields, and began the long transformation of Ireland's wildness into landscape. And they built. Across the rolling hills of the island, they raised something utterly new. Megalithic tombs, great hunks of stone aligned with sun and star, carved with spirals, lozenges, and chevrons whose meanings still evade us. These people moved stones that weighed tons with no wheels and no beasts of burden. What they lacked in machines, they made up for in vision. The tomb at Newgrange, older than the pyramids of Egypt, was engineered with such precision that the rising sun on the winter solstice floods its inner chamber with golden light for just 17 minutes a year. What kind of people go to such effort just to catch a sliver of sun in the coldest season? What did it mean to them? Were they praying for the return of warmth, honoring the dead, appealing to gods whose names we will never know? We cannot ask them. They left no written word, but they left the stones, hundreds of them, standing in lonely fields, watching the sky. These monuments are not just graves. They are echoes of a worldview lost. At Polnabrone, a portal tomb rises like a cracked tooth in the limestone desert of the Burren. At Carrowmore and Carrowkeel, vast cemeteries of cairns and passage tombs dot the western lands, older than Stonehenge. The dead were buried with grave goods, beads, tools, food, sometimes cremated, sometimes not. The living must have believed in something, an afterlife, a cycle, a journey beyond the veil. And it wasn't just practical, it was sacred. In time, these Neolithic builders disappeared, not entirely, but culturally. Around 2500 BCE, a new influence arrived, the Bronze Age. With it came metallurgy, new burial customs, and new gods. The dead were now buried in wedge tombs, ring barrows, and stone circles. Gold ornaments appear, finely crafted lunarly, and torques, found buried in bogs or stashed in hoards. This was no longer the simple life of farmers alone, yet for Winnie this was society, stratified, ritualized, perhaps already shadowed by power. And with the Bronze Age came myth, not in the sense of what they believed, we still don't know, but in the stories that later generations told of them. Because sometime in the distant future, when writing finally came to Ireland, poets and scribes would whisper of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, a divine race of luminous beings who descended from the sky in dark clouds and brought wisdom, music, and magic to the land. They fought battles, ruled with justice, and eventually were driven underground, becoming the Aus Sea, the fairy folk of later legend. These myths were not written by the people they described. They were written down thousands of years later, but they were spoken for centuries, shaped and reshaped by fireside tales and bardic memory. And perhaps somewhere in the tangled blend of fiction and oral truth lies a memory of the Bronze Age peoples, the mysterious mound builders, the bringers of gold and stone. Archaeologists scoff at fairy stories, but they still marvel at the precision of sites like Drombeg Stone Circle in County Cork, where the midwinter sun sets between two aligned stones, or Begmore in Tyrone, with its pattern of circles and cairns and lines, as if someone had written a message in stone, and then erased the key. By 500 BCE, the world changed again. A new culture began to stir across Ireland, the Iron Age Celts. But before they came, before the iron blades and chariots and hill forts, before the druids raised oak branches to the sky, there was a people here. People who hunted and harvested and buried their dead with care, who raised tombs that spoke to the sky, who understood the seasons better than we do, who lived and died without ever writing a single word, and yet spoke volumes through the stones they left behind. In those early ages, Ireland had no kings, no cities, no borders, just tribes and kinships, stories and stars. The forests were vast, the bogs deep, the rivers untamed. Wolves howled in the night, giant elk roamed the hills, and somewhere in that wildness a culture took root. The seeds of Irish identity, not in names or nations, but in the very rhythm of life on the land, were being planted. A sense of time measured not by clocks but by solstice shadows. A reverence for place, the hill, the river bend, the sacred well, that would outlive empire after empire. And a sense that death was not the end but a passage, that the sun would rise again, even in the darkest cave. This is the Ireland that came before Ireland, before tribes took names, before Rome ever looked west, before the saints came with their gospels, an island of mist, stone, and silence, and yet it was never truly silent. Its people, whoever they were, listened to the wind, the sea, the birds. They carved spirals on tomb walls and aligned chambers to the sun, as if to say, we were here and we understood something. Now only the stones remain, but they still speak, if you know how to listen. And from the shadow of these silent stones, a new people would rise, the Celts, with iron and legend, war and art. They would give Ireland new gods, new names, and a voice that would echo far beyond the island's shores. And so the story continues. Chapter 2. Druids, Warriors, and the Celtic Dawn. When the first whisper of iron rang out across the hills of Ireland, the island was already ancient. The tombs still stood, silent and cold. The stones remembered the solstices, but a new people were arriving, fierce, poetic, warlike, and filled with fire. They brought not just new tools and weapons, but new names, gods, and dreams. They were the Celts. No one knows exactly when the Celts arrived. It was not one grand invasion, but a slow tide of language, culture, and belief. Some may have come by sea from Gaul or Iberia, others overland through Britain. By 500 BCE, Ireland had changed. The people now spoke an Indo-European tongue, filled with rhythm and song. They smelted iron, forged blades that could slice through bronze, and built ring forts on hills like thrones carved into the land. The Neolithic quiet was over. This was the age of warriors. The Celts did not build empires, they built tribes, clans bound by blood, honour, and oath. There was no single king of Ireland, only many kings, each ruling a small territory called a tuath. These kingdoms rose and fell like flames. Alliances were made and broken, cattle raided, poets bribed, and warriors tested. It was a world that respected bravery, beauty, and memory. To be forgotten was a fate worse than death. At the heart of Celtic life was not the sword, but the word. Bards, satirists, storytellers, and poets. These were the keepers of truth. A king could be slain by a well-aimed verse. A poem could ruin reputations more swiftly than war. Memory was sacred, and history lived not in books but in mouths. The bards knew the lineages, the battles, the laws. They sang of heroes like Cuchulainn, who stood alone against armies, or Fionn mac Cumhail, the wise leader of the Fianna who gained wisdom by tasting the salmon of knowledge. These weren't just tales, they were templates, ideals, maps of identity. But even the bards bowed to another power, higher than kings, older than warriors, more feared than war itself, the druids. They were the priests, judges, philosophers, astronomers, and magicians of the Celtic world. No decision of importance was made without them. They studied for 20 years, memorizing thousands of verses and the secrets of the stars. They knew the healing plants and the sacred groves. They could curse with a glance, bless with a branch, and summon silence with a word. They held no swords, yet all swords obeyed them. Druids did not build temples. The forest was their cathedral. Oak trees were sacred. So were mistletoe, the moon, and still water. They spoke of the other world, a realm beyond this one, neither hell nor heaven, but a mirror full of light and danger. It was there the dead went. It was from there that the gods came, and the gods were many. The Celtic pantheon was not orderly like Olympus. It was wild, shifting, alive. There was the Dagda, the good god, with his vast cauldron of endless food. There was Lugh, the shining warrior of many skills who would one day slay the dark giant Balor with a spear of fire. There was Brigid, goddess of healing and poetry, whose flame never went out. There was Morrigan, the phantom queen of war, who appeared before battle as a raven on a bloody field. The Celts did not ask for mercy from their gods. They honored them, feared them, and tried to understand their omens. Each tribe had its own local deities and spirits. Rivers were sacred, so were hills, lakes, and certain stones. Every bend in the land might hide a power. Every mist might be a veil between worlds. To be Celtic was to live in a world thick with meaning, where nature spoke, dreams warned, and stories explained what the eye could not. But life was not just myth and music, it was also brutal. Blood mattered, who your ancestors were, whom you owed loyalty to. Women could hold great power, own property, lead warriors, even become druids. But raids were constant. Honor had to be defended. Cattle were currency, and insult demanded retribution. The Brehon laws, complex and surprisingly progressive for their time, guided this chaotic world, recording compensation for broken limbs, stolen goods, or insults to reputation. It was not law as we know it, but it kept the fabric from tearing. In this world of tribes, the idea of Ireland as a single nation did not yet exist, but the seeds were being planted in blood and story. Heroes roamed the land, and their exploits were remembered from one coast to another. The Hill of Tara, in modern-day Meath, became a centre of kingship, a place where rulers gathered not just to feast, but to be bound by oath and ritual to the land itself. The king, they believed, must be wedded to the land. If the land suffered famine or plague, it was a sign he had broken his sacred bond. Power was not only political, it was spiritual. And yet, for all the chaos of this tribal tapestry, there was connection. The Celtic language formed a web of understanding. Poets from Ulster could be welcomed in Munster. Warriors found employment far from home. Pilgrimages were made to sacred sites. In the west, they built stone forts on cliffs overlooking the sea. In the north, great earthworks rose, like Emain Macha, the legendary seat of the Red Branch warriors. Across the island the stories spread, of warriors cursed by beauty, of kings betrayed by druids, of lovers bound in death. Time in Celtic Ireland moved in circles, not lines. The festivals reflected the eternal cycle. Samhain, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Imbolc, the first sign of spring. Beltane, the fire festival of summer, and Lughnasadh, the harvest celebration. These weren't just holidays, they were cosmic events observed with fire, dance, and sacrifice. There is evidence that human sacrifice may have taken place, victims buried in bogs, perhaps offerings to gods of fertility or war. Their bodies preserved for millennia, faces frozen in time, speak silently of a faith deeper and darker than we can grasp. But the Celts were not a stagnant people. They traded gold, horses, wine, ideas. Roman goods reached Irish shores even though the legions never came. Ireland remained just out of reach of Roman conquest, a curious mystery to the empire. The Romans called it Hibernia, the land of winter. Some Roman writers claim druids came to Ireland to escape persecution. Others described it as wild, untamed, full of sorcery and song. By the time the Roman world began to crumble, Ireland remained defiantly itself. A land of clans and stories, of warriors who carved their names in memory, not marble. A land where poets were more dangerous than generals and where power came not just from strength, but from knowledge of the old ways. But change was coming. Across the sea, a new faith was stirring, a faith with one God, one book, one truth. It would not be spread by conquest, but by words, and it would find in Ireland not resistance, but something stranger, welcome. For the druids, the warriors, the kings, none of them could have imagined that a young man kidnapped from Britain would return not as a slave, but as a saint. That the sacred groves would one day give way to stone churches. That the fiery tongue of the bard would be turned to psalms. The Celtic dawn was brilliant, fierce, and short-lived. It left behind stories that still live in our myths. It carved its values into the bones of the land, and though it would soon be transformed, it was never truly erased. In every place name, in every ruined ring fort, in every whispered tale of the banshee or the fairy mound, the Celts remain. The druids knew the wind's secrets, the warriors sang before battle, and the poets made sure none of it would be forgotten. The old gods were not gone, they were only waiting. Just beneath the surface, in the mist, in the stones, in the stories. And then came Patrick. Chapter 3. St. Patrick and the Christian Transformation. Long before Patrick set foot on Irish soil, the island was already sacred. Its hills whispered the names of gods, its rivers flowed with memory, and its people listened to the wind like scripture. The druids held the world together with words and rites. The poets sang of heroes and omens, and the sacred groves knew the footsteps of kings. But change was coming, not with sword or empire, but with silence, scripture, and the cross. And at the heart of that change stood a man whose story would become legend. Patrick, the unwelcome guest who became Ireland's chosen saint. He wasn't Irish. He wasn't even particularly religious when he arrived. Patrick was born in Roman Britain, perhaps in modern-day Wales or Western England, sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century. His father was a deacon, his grandfather a priest. But Patrick himself cared little for the faith in his youth. Then at 16, the sea tore his life apart. Irish raiders struck the coast, seized him, and dragged him across the waters into slavery. For 6 long years he herded sheep in the cold fields of Ulster or Connaught, a foreigner among pagans, alone with the wind and his thoughts. And somewhere in that loneliness, something broke open inside him. Patrick later wrote that he began to pray, constantly, instinctively, almost without sleep. In his own words, it was then that God found him. Dreams stirred in him, voices called. One night a vision came, a ship was waiting. He fled, journeyed hundreds of miles and found a boat that carried him back to Britain. But he didn't stay. Years passed. Patrick trained in the church. He studied, perhaps in Gaul. And then another dream, a voice from Ireland pleading, "Come back and walk among us again." And so he did. But this time, not as a slave, but as a missionary. The Ireland he returned to was still tribal, still ruled by petty kings, still watched over by druids and warrior chieftains. But Patrick came not with an army, nor with riches, nor with Roman might. He came with stories, stories of a single God who had no shape, who loved slaves and kings alike, who died and rose again, not in myth, but in time. It was a dangerous message. The druids were powerful, and some kings saw Patrick as a threat. But he kept going, village by village, clan by clan. Legend tells us that he lit a fire on the hill of Slane on the eve of Easter, a blaze that challenged the druids' sacred fires on the nearby hill of Tara. It was a symbolic act, a duel of faiths. The High King summoned him. Patrick came, bold and calm. He explained his faith, not with threats, but with symbols. One tale says he picked a shamrock and used its 3 leaves to explain the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God in 3 forms. Whether true or apocryphal, the story stuck. The shamrock became a national symbol, and Patrick won more than the king's tolerance. He won the people. But Patrick's path was not smooth. He was imprisoned more than once. He wrote of betrayals and trials. Yet he kept preaching. He baptized thousands. He ordained priests. He destroyed idols, but not with violence. He offered something stronger than fear, forgiveness, purpose, a God who walked as man and knew suffering. He wrote Confessio, a raw, heartfelt account of his mission, and in it his voice is clear, defiant, and humble. He didn't see himself as a saint. He called himself a sinner, the least of all, but Ireland remembered him differently. In time, Patrick was no longer just a missionary. He became myth. Stories grew around him like ivy. He drove out the snakes, though Ireland never had any. He raised the dead. He fasted for 40 days on a mountain top. He cursed kings who defied him and blessed rivers that welcomed him. Whether true or embellished, the tales revealed what the Irish felt. Patrick had changed the soul of the island, but Patrick didn't bring Christianity to Ireland alone. Others came too, Palladius, the first bishop sent from Rome, and unnamed monks who walked the coasts. Yet it was Patrick whose fire caught the wind. His legacy wasn't in buildings or relics, but in what came next, because once the flame was lit, it roared. Ireland embraced Christianity with a strange, beautiful zeal. Unlike in other parts of Europe, the new faith didn't erase the old. It absorbed it. The druids faded, but their wisdom lived on in the early monks. Sacred groves gave way to stone cells, but the reverence for nature remained. The old festivals were recast in Christian light. Samhain became All Saints' Day. Imbolc became Brigid's feast, now a saint, no longer a goddess, but still tending the flame. Monasteries sprang up like stars across the countryside, but these were not just places of worship. They were fortresses of memory, sanctuaries of learning. In places like Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Kells, monks copied not just scripture, but science, law, and poetry. They illuminated manuscripts with swirling art, knotwork, gold leaf, and strange beasts that seemed to dance across the page. The Book of Kells, created around 800 AD, remains a masterpiece of devotion and imagination, a window into a mind that saw beauty and holiness as one. In a Europe darkened by war and the fall of Rome, Ireland became a beacon. While cities burned on the continent, Irish monks preserved Latin texts, copied the Gospels, and even set out as missionaries of their own. Columba crossed to Iona, Columbanus travelled as far as Italy. They brought books, faith, and memory. The Irish, once considered barbarians by the Roman world, now became its unlikely librarians. Monastic life was harsh. Days began in darkness with chanting. Monks farmed, fasted, studied, and prayed. But there was joy too. Irish Christianity was uniquely poetic, its prayers laced with natural imagery, its hymns sung like sagas. Saints were seen not as distant icons, but as neighbours. Men and women who walked among the people, offered blessings and shared meals. Women too played their part. Saint Brigid, whether drawn from the goddess or born a fiery Christian soul, founded monasteries, healed the sick, and became one of Ireland's most beloved figures. Her presence softened the faith, braided it into the lives of mothers, daughters, and midwives. Christianity didn't end the violence of Ireland. Clans still feuded, kings still raided, But it introduced something new, an idea of peace that transcended bloodlines, a law higher than tribal honor, a kingdom not of men but of heaven. And it offered hope, not just for this life, but for the next. The druids once read the stars to find their truth. Now monks looked to scripture. The warrior's strength had once been in his spear. Now it could be found in a quiet scriptorium, a quill in hand. The bards still sang, but now their verses ended in Amen. Ireland didn't become Christian overnight. Pagan customs lingered. Old gods were remembered in whispered stories. But the transformation was deep and lasting. And it came not through war, but through words. Through a man stolen from his home, broken by exile, and returned by grace. Patrick died, they say, on March 17th, around the year 461. The date became his feast day. Over centuries, it became something more, a symbol of Irish identity itself. Today, parades march in his name, rivers are dyed green, and people across the world wear shamrocks. But behind the celebration lies something quieter, older, truer, a story of faith, resilience, and change. Christianity didn't erase Ireland's soul, it transformed it. The sacred never left, it merely changed its name. The monks would keep the fire alive for centuries to come, but beyond the monastery walls, shadows were moving. Across the sea, long ships were being built. Warriors with axes and strange gods were looking west. The land of saints and scholars was about to be tested by fire once again, and the next chapter would be written in blood. Chapter 4. The Viking Tide. The monks had barely finished illuminating their gospels when the first longships appeared on the horizon. Sleek as serpents, carved with dragon heads and painted in fear, the vessels came gliding across the water like omens. The tide that once brought Patrick and peace now returned with axe and fire. Ireland, the land of saints and scholars, was about to meet the Norsemen. The year was 795 when the first recorded Viking raid struck Ireland. It came like a lightning bolt out of the north, fast, brutal, and devastating. The island of Lambay off the coast of Dublin felt the sting first. Then, not long after, they came for the monasteries Retru, Iona, Bangor, Clonmacnoise. Places once built for prayer became battlegrounds. Gold chalices were snatched, relics scattered, monks slaughtered or taken in chains. The raiders were not interested in theology. They came for treasure, cattle, and slaves. They came for glory. But this was no passing storm. It was a tide. The Norse raids continued, relentless over decades. At first, they were hit and run. Small groups would strike the coasts and disappear before any force could assemble. But soon they stayed. The long ships returned with more men, more steel, and more ambition. What began as plunder became settlement. What began as terror became transformation. By the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings were not just raiders, they were colonists. They established long forts, fortified ship camps along rivers and harbours, perfect bases for striking inland and building trade. Some of these long forts would grow into towns. One of them, in a shallow estuary on the River Liffey, became Dublin, the Black Pool. Today we call it Dublin. Dublin was not born Irish, it was born Norse. A base for slaves and silver, for weapons and wine. Its markets buzzed with goods from far beyond Ireland's shores, Frankish swords, Baltic amber, Islamic coins. The Vikings were not mere barbarians, they were merchants, explorers, shipbuilders. They connected Ireland to a wider world, one it had only brushed before. In Dublin, cultures collided, Gaelic, Norse, Christian, pagan, and slowly something new began to take shape. But it came at a cost. The Viking Wars ripped through Ireland's fragile web of petty kingdoms. Some Irish kings resisted, others made deals. Old tribal rivalries were sharpened by Norse alliances. The High Kingship, already a tenuous concept, became a prize to be bought with Viking steel. Monasteries became fortresses. Scribes inked their gospels with one eye on the horizon. The Norse did not just take, they forced the Irish to redefine power. And yet even in the blood there was transformation. Over time, the Vikings stopped being foreigners. They married Irish women, adopted Irish customs, and baptized their children. A new class emerged, the Hiberno-Norse. Neither fully Norse nor fully Irish, they lived in towns while the native Irish remained mostly rural. These towns, Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Limerick, became engines of commerce, places where coins replaced cattle as currency, and urban life began to sprout on Irish soil. The Hiberno-Norse spoke both languages. They brewed mead, raised churches, and buried their dead with swords in one hand and crosses around their necks. They brought shipbuilding, town planning, and a taste for trade that Ireland had never fully embraced. They connected the island to the Viking world, stretching from Iceland to Constantinople. In their wake came new influences, new tools, new ideas, but the violence never fully ceased. Throughout the 10th century, Irish kings pushed back. The battle lines shifted. Viking warlords fought each other as often as they fought the Irish. Dublin was taken, lost, and retaken. Fortunes rose and fell with the tide. It wasn't until 1014 on the fields of Clontarf that the tide began to recede. That year, the High King Brian Boru, an Irishman of rare vision and greater ambition, faced the combined forces of Dublin's Norsemen, their Leinster allies, and foreign Viking reinforcements. The Battle of Clontarf was not just about one throne, it was a struggle for the soul of Ireland. Brian's army won. The Viking threat was broken, but Brian was killed, and the island remained divided. Yet the outcome echoed. The Norse grip weakened. They were no longer conquerors, they were now part of Ireland's fabric. Their towns remained, but their kings faded. Their gods were forgotten, replaced by Christ and the saints. Their bloodline, though, ran deep, in names, in ships, in streets that still traced their foundations. The Viking tide had reshaped Ireland. It did not destroy her, it forced her to evolve, to build towns, to think beyond tribes, to balance blade and prayer. And in that crucible, something new began to form. An Ireland that could look outward, that had seen the world and survived it. And though the Norsemen faded into legend, their legacy did not. Dublin would become the heart of Ireland's future. Trade would grow, towns would spread, and the memory of the longships once feared would become part of the story Ireland tells about itself, not as victim but as survivor. But Ireland's peace was always brief. In the distance, another wave was forming, this time not from the sea, but from across the narrow channel. A new kind of invader was coming, not Vikings but Normans, and they would not just settle, they would claim. Chapter 5. High Kings and the Dream of Unity. The Vikings had brought fire to the shores of Ireland, but they had not brought order. Long after the first longships landed, and long after Dublin had been carved into a Norse stronghold, the island remained a mosaic of shifting power. Kings ruled over fragments, tuatha and provinces, each claiming bloodlines older than memory, each dreaming of supremacy. But unity was rare and fleeting. Ireland's ancient song was still sung in many voices. At the heart of this fractured world lay a fragile idea, the high kingship of Ireland. The Ard Rí, a king of kings, one who would hold sway not just by force, but by recognition, by prestige, by the careful balancing of alliances and oaths. But this title, so grand in its imagining, was elusive in practice. Most high kings ruled only over portions of the island. Their influence depended more on clever marriages and brutal raids than on lasting institutions. True unity remained a dream, spoken in bardic verse, more than reality on the ground. Into this world of endless rivalry rose a man unlike the others. He came not from the ancient ruling dynasties of Tara or Ulster, but from the damp, wind-swept west, Munster, a province more often seen as wild than powerful. His name was Brian Boru, and his ambition would shake the very roots of Ireland. Born around 941 into the Dalgie Case, a small clan near Killaloe, Brian was not expected to rule. His older brother Mathgamain was king of Munster, and Brian was merely a warrior in his shadow. But the Norse were still strong in the region. Limerick remained a Norse city, and the Viking lords of the Shannon still raided and ruled with iron, and coin. Brian, growing up in this world, saw something the other Irish kings often missed, that the enemy was not just foreign, but internal, that as long as the Irish remained divided, they would remain vulnerable. When Mathgamain was treacherously killed by a rival Irish lord allied with the Norse, Brian took up the mantle. He did not forgive, and he did not forget. Over the next decades, he led a campaign of ruthless brilliance against the Norse, against rival Munster lords, and against the old dynasties who looked down on his rise. Brian was no ordinary warlord. He fought, but he also built. He sponsored churches, supported monasteries, and fostered learning. He gave gifts to bards, and in return, the bards gave him immortality. But it was his military mind that changed the island. He understood the rivers, the tides, the psychology of siege. He knew when to strike and when to wait, and above all, he understood the power of symbolism. By 1002, Brian had outmaneuvered the ruling Uí Néill dynasty and claimed the high kingship for himself. It was the first time in centuries that a man outside that northern line had taken the title. It was not merely conquest, it was revolution. The dream of unity, long whispered at the hill of Tara, suddenly seemed real. But peace, as always in Ireland, was temporary. The Norse in Dublin, though weakened, remained powerful. The King of Leinster, Mael Mordor, chafed under Brian's authority. Old rivalries flared, alliances shifted like wind-blown banners. In 1013 the tensions erupted. Mael Mordor and Sitric Silkbeard, the Norse King of Dublin, joined forces. They called on Viking mercenaries from the Isle of Man and the Orkneys. It was a desperate, massive gamble. The stage was set for one of the most legendary battles in Irish history. Brian, now in his 70s, gathered his own forces. Men from Munster, Connaught, and even parts of Ulster rallied to him. His son Murchad led the army. Brian, too old to fight, remained in the rear, but his presence loomed large, a symbol of the unity he had forged. On April 23rd, 1014, Good Friday, the two sides met at Clontarf on the north shore of Dublin Bay. It was not a clean clash of nations. It was a swirl of Irish versus Irish, Norse versus Norse, friends against old friends, tribes testing their loyalties under a blood-red sky. The battle raged for hours, swords rang, bodies fell, and the tide crept slowly in. Murchad, Brian's son, fought like a hero from legend. He led the charge against the foreign Vikings and broke their lines. One by one, the Norse leaders fell. The mercenaries from the Orkneys were cut down. Sitric Silkbeard watched the battle from the walls of Dublin, powerless to stop what unfolded. As the sun set, the Viking threat was broken, but the cost was staggering. Murchad was dead. Countless Irish warriors lay beside him. And somewhere, in a quiet grove near the rear of the battle, Brian Boru, the High King, was murdered by retreating Norse fighters. They found his tent, they found the old man in prayer, and they struck. With Brian's death, the unity he had forged began to unravel. His descendants lacked his strength and his vision. The dream of a centralized Ireland faded once more into rivalry and revenge, but Clontarf mattered. Not because it ended Viking power, it didn't entirely, nor because it established permanent peace, it didn't, but because it became legend. The bards turned it into a symbol. Brian Boru, the unifier from the west, the old man who rose above petty tribalism, became a national icon. Clontarf became the moment when Ireland stood as one, however briefly, and pushed back the darkness. The Norse would never recover. They remained in their towns, intermarried, converted, and blended into the tapestry of Irish life. But the age of Norse dominance was over. Ireland, though still divided, was now decisively Irish again, and yet the lessons of Brian's rise and fall remained unlearned. After his death, the island once more dissolved into regional struggles. The High Kingship continued in name, but its power weakened. No one could hold the centre. The old rivalries returned with sharpened teeth. Ireland stood at the edge of a new millennium, exhausted and disunified, its tribal kings dreaming once again of crowns they could never quite grasp. The Norse had tested the island and been absorbed, but from across the sea, another people were watching. They spoke French, they were armoured, organised and ruthless, and unlike the Vikings, they didn't come for loot, they came to rule. Chapter 6. The Norman Invasion. Ireland had survived the storm of the Vikings. It had buried its high kings, rebuilt its monasteries, and returned to the rhythm of tribal life. For a moment, the island felt like its old self again, fractured, yes, but fiercely independent. The Norse had been absorbed, their towns woven into Irish life. Yet beneath the surface, the familiar cycle of rivalry continued. Kings jostled for dominance, alliances were made and broken, and the dream of unity faded into legend once more. But Ireland's greatest upheaval was still to come, and it would arrive not by force of sea, but by invitation. The man who opened the door was an Irish king named Diarmait mac Murchada. He ruled Leinster, a province of considerable power in the southeast, and like so many Irish kings before him, he was caught in a feud. In 1166, Diarmait was deposed and exiled by a coalition of Irish rivals led by the High King Ruaidhri Ua Conchobair. Diarmait was a controversial figure, ruthless, cunning, and deeply unpopular. But he was not the sort of man to vanish quietly. Instead, he crossed the sea to England, and from there to the court of Normandy. And there, in a moment of desperation that would change Irish history forever, he begged for help. He made an offer. If foreign knights would aid him in reclaiming Leinster, he would reward them with land, gold, and titles. It was an irresistible bargain for a certain kind of man, land-hungry, ambitious, and bred for war. And among them was one who answered the call with particular interest, Richard de Clare, known to history as Strongbow. Strongbow was a Norman nobleman of fading fortune. His father had lost favour with the English king, and Strongbow needed a way back into power. Diarmait's proposal offered exactly that. In exchange for his sword, Strongbow would not only receive land, but also Diarmait's daughter, Aoife, in marriage, and with her the promise of inheritance. It was a dynastic move wrapped in steel. In 1169, the first wave of Norman adventurers landed in Ireland, not a full-scale army, but a vanguard of heavily armoured knights and archers. They came not as conquerors, but as guests. Within months, they had helped Diarmait retake Wexford and regain a foothold in Leinster. The Irish had never faced anything like them. The Normans fought in tight formations, wore chainmail and helmets, and rode war horses into battle with terrifying precision. Against the tribal levies of Ireland, they were a storm of metal. The following year, Strongbow himself arrived. He took Waterford, then marched on Dublin, seizing it from rival Irish factions. The city that had once been Viking was now Norman. Diarmait was restored, but his bargain had consequences. When he died in 1171, Strongbow claimed the kingship of Leinster by marriage, and with it, a direct line of power on Irish soil. The Normans were no longer guests, they were lords. The Irish quickly realized their mistake. What had begun as an internal feud had turned into a foreign occupation. Strongbow and his men began constructing castles, stone and timber fortresses that dotted the countryside, projecting strength in every direction. Where once Irish kings built ring forts and hilltop dwellings, the Normans built high walls and motte and bailey strongholds. These were not just military structures, they were symbols the Normans had come to stay. But the story didn't end with Strongbow. His success drew the attention of a far greater power, King Henry II of England. Alarmed by the growing independence of his nobles abroad and wary that Ireland might become a rival Norman kingdom, Henry crossed the sea himself in 1171 with a massive force. The Irish kings, shocked by the scale of the operation, submitted to him one by one. They had no desire to provoke another conquest, and so Henry claimed overlordship of Ireland in the name of the English crown. From that moment forward, Ireland was no longer merely an island of kings. It had become a political frontier of the Angevin Empire. But conquest is never clean. The Normans did not overrun the island in a single sweep. Instead, they carved out territories along the eastern and southern coasts, the Pale, around Dublin, the cities of Kilkenny, Waterford, and Limerick. These became centres of Norman rule, law, and culture. The newcomers built towns, introduced new agricultural methods, and brought the English language, the feudal system, and a different kind of governance. They also brought church reform, aligning Irish Christianity more closely with Rome. And yet outside these strongholds, Ireland remained stubbornly Irish. The Gaelic lords retreated to the interior, to Connaught and Ulster, and the wild mountain ranges that no castle could tame. There, the old ways survived. The Brehon laws still guided the people. The Irish language still sang through the valleys. The tribes still fought, still married, still remembered. But something strange began to happen. The longer the Normans stayed, the more they changed. Many intermarried with Gaelic nobility. They adopted Irish customs, wore Irish dress, spoke Irish words. Their children born on Irish soil often saw themselves less as foreigners and more as Irish lords with Norman roots. A saying spread among the English crown, "More Irish than the Irish themselves." The crown did not approve. Over time, efforts were made to restrict this Gaelicization. The Statutes of Kilkenny, passed in 1366, forbade English settlers from using the Irish language, marrying into Irish families, or following Irish law. But such decrees often went ignored in practice. The frontier between Norman and Irish was never a clean line. It was a foggy border filled with shifting allegiances and shared blood. Still, the Norman presence had permanently reshaped Ireland. Power was no longer tribal alone, it was dynastic. Castles replaced hill forts, towns grew where there had once been none, trade expanded, coinage circulated. The idea of centralized rule, though resisted, had taken root. But unity still eluded the island. The crown's grip weakened during times of English political chaos. In those moments, Gaelic resurgence stirred. Families like the O'Neills and O'Donnells reclaimed territory. Gaelic lords grew rich, powerful, and bold. But just as they seemed poised to reclaim what was lost, English power would return, more organized, more bureaucratic, more determined. The Norman invasion had begun with one man's desperation, but it ended with centuries of transformation. A new elite had risen, not fully Irish, not fully English, but something in between. They would dominate Irish politics for generations, walk both worlds, and lay the foundations for centuries of conflict. And all the while, the dream of a unified Ireland, one king, one law, one people, remained just that, a dream. Because the great irony of Diarmait Mac Murchada's gamble was that in trying to reclaim his own corner of Ireland, he had invited in a force far larger, far more lasting than any king could control. The Normans would never truly leave. They would change names, change clothes, change loyalties, but the structures they built, both physical and political, would remain. Ireland was no longer just Irish, it was now something more complex, more divided, more layered. And from that layered foundation, a new chapter was preparing to rise, not with swords or stones, but with laws, taxes, plantations, and the slow tightening grip of the Tudor crown. Chapter 7. The Tudors and the Fall of the Old Gaelic World. By the dawn of the 16th century, Ireland was a land of uneasy coexistence. The island was still divided between Gaelic lords and Anglo-Irish nobles, between ancient traditions and foreign rule, between those who clung to freedom and those who answered to the English crown. Outside the Pale, that narrow strip of land around Dublin where English law held sway, Ireland remained a patchwork of clans, customs, and rivalries. The crown's reach was shallow, but that would not last. Across the sea, a new dynasty sat on the throne of England. The Tudors, ruthless, pragmatic, and obsessed with control. They had won a kingdom through blood and clever marriages. Now they turned their eyes to Ireland, not as a distant possession, but as a land to be moulded, tamed, and above all, ruled. What had once been a neglected frontier was about to become the target of a colonial machine. It began with Henry VIII, the same king who split with Rome and created the Church of England, now declared himself not just Lord of Ireland, but King of Ireland. The title wasn't just symbolic, it was a signal. The days of indirect rule were ending. The crown would no longer tolerate disobedient earls, semi-independent lords, or the old Brehon laws that governed the Gaelic world. Everything would now flow from London, its religion, its law, its order. But Ireland did not surrender easily. Many Gaelic chiefs had no love for Rome, but they had even less for Henry's agents. The monasteries, which had survived Viking raids and Norman conquest, now faced a new threat: dissolution. Lands were seized, churches plundered, abbeys reduced to ruins. Gaelic poets wrote of the destruction with horror, the end of holy places, the scattering of monks, the death of memory. Still the crown pushed forward. Henry's strategy was called surrender and re-grant. Irish lords were to give up their ancestral titles, swear loyalty to the king, and receive them back as English-style peers, now earls and barons, no longer chieftains. Some agreed, hoping to preserve their lands. Others refused, unwilling to trade centuries of tradition for foreign parchment. When Henry died, his children continued the campaign. Edward VI, a boy king, pressed the Protestant Reformation harder. Mary I, a Catholic, briefly reversed it. Then came Elizabeth I, sharp-minded, steel-hearted, and determined to bring Ireland to heel. She saw the island not as a neighbour but as a threat. Spain was powerful, France was lurking, and Catholic Ireland, left ungoverned, might become a dagger pointed at England's back. Under Elizabeth, the English campaign escalated. Rebellions were crushed, not merely defeated. The policy shifted from negotiation to conquest. New plantations were introduced. English settlers granted Irish lands to dilute native power. The Crown no longer merely ruled parts of Ireland, it wanted to reshape the very soul of the island. But the Gaelic world did not die quietly. In the north, in the wild lands of Ulster, two lords emerged who would lead the final, desperate stand of the old order: Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Hugh Roe O'Donnell, Prince of Tyrconnell. Both were born into powerful clans, both were raised in the shadow of Tudor interference, and both understood that the future of Gaelic Ireland hung by a thread. In 1594, war erupted. It would last 9 bloody years and become known as the 9 Years' War. O'Neill and O'Donnell rallied not just Gaelic warriors but Anglo-Irish allies and even foreign aid from Catholic Spain. They struck quickly, decisively, and with terrifying efficiency. They ambushed English troops in mountain passes, burned fortresses, and held vast territory. For a moment it seemed as if they might turn back the tide. At the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598, O'Neill crushed an English army, sending shockwaves through Dublin and London alike. Panic spread. Elizabeth, now aging and childless, feared she might lose Ireland entirely. Reinforcements were rushed across the sea, more taxes, more soldiers, more cruelty. Then came Kinsale. In 1601, a Spanish fleet landed in the southern port town, hoping to aid the Irish cause. O'Neill and O'Donnell marched their armies across the country to join them, a daring manoeuvre, but the English commander, Lord Mountjoy, moved faster. He surrounded Kinsale and forced the Irish-Spanish alliance into a pitched battle. It was a disaster. The Irish lines broke, the Spanish surrendered. O'Donnell fled to Spain to seek more help and died in exile. O'Neill retreated north, harried and broken. The war limped on for another year, but the outcome was clear. In 1603, O'Neill submitted. Elizabeth died weeks later, and with her death came the final blow to the Gaelic world, not with fire or blade, but with silence. In 1607, Hugh O'Neill and other surviving Gaelic lords secretly boarded a ship at Rathmullen and sailed into exile. They hoped to find support on the continent, to return with armies and reclaim what was lost, but they never returned. The flight of the Earls, as it came to be known, was more than the end of a rebellion. It was the end of an age. With their departure, The ancient Gaelic aristocracy, kings and chieftains who had ruled for over 1,000 years, vanished. Their lands were confiscated, their names faded, their power broken. What remained was a land stripped of its old anchors, ready to be reshaped by foreign hands. And reshape it they did. Ulster, once the most defiantly Gaelic province, was transformed into a plantation. English and Scottish settlers flooded in, granted land taken from the O'Neills and O'Donnells. New towns rose: Derry, Coleraine, Enniskillen. The Irish who remained were pushed to the margins, forbidden to carry arms, excluded from power, reduced to tenants on what had once been their own soil. The Crown's policies were clear: replace the people, replace the culture, replace the future. Ireland was not yet called a colony, but in every way that mattered, it had become one. English law, English language, English religion. Those who resisted were labelled rebels. Those who complied were watched closely. Yet even in defeat, something of Ireland endured. The Irish language, driven from court and law, survived in cottages and songs. The old stories of Tú Chulainn, of Brian Boru, of the Tuatha De Danann were whispered still. Faith remained strong, now deeply tied to Catholicism, which itself became a form of resistance. And while the great houses of the Gaelic world crumbled, their ghosts lingered in ruined towers, in the names of valleys, in the dreams of a people who refused to forget. The Tudor conquest had done what the Vikings and Normans had not. It broke the back of native Irish power, it redrew the map, it silenced the old voices. But it did not erase them. Beneath the surface, Ireland remained Ireland. Yet what came next would be even more brutal. For a storm was gathering: wars of religion, rebellion, famine, and forced migration. The next century would test the soul of Ireland in ways no one could have imagined. The earls had fled, the chieftains were gone. And now a new empire was rising. The English had conquered the land, but they had not yet conquered the spirit. Chapter 8. Plantations, Cromwell and Bloodshed. The Gaelic lords had fled. Their castles stood empty, their clans scattered. Ireland, once ruled by native kings and ancient laws, now lay in the iron grip of the English crown. But conquest was never the end. It was merely the beginning of transformation. The 16th century had been a battle of swords and titles. The 17th would be a battle for the very soul of the land, its people, its religion, its memory. And it would be one of the darkest centuries Ireland had ever known. The Tudor conquest had left behind a new kind of vacuum, one the English were determined to fill not just with soldiers, but with settlers. The idea was simple: take the land from those who might rebel and give it to those who were loyal. A strategic reshaping of Ireland's population, culture, and identity. This was the age of the plantations. The first major effort began in Ulster, the once fierce stronghold of Gaelic resistance. After the flight of the earls in 1607, the Crown seized vast tracts of land in the north and offered them to English and Scottish Protestants. Entire counties were carved up. New towns were laid out with straight roads and market squares. Settlers arrived with ploughs, Bibles, and new names for old places. The native Irish were pushed aside, allowed only to labour, if at all, on the land their ancestors had held for centuries. It was a colony in all but name. Fortified settlements sprang up like teeth. Derry became Londonderry. Armagh was transformed from a seat of ancient Irish Christianity into a Protestant stronghold. The Irish who remained faced restrictions, surveillance, and humiliation. Their religion, Catholicism, was increasingly seen as treasonous. Their language, their customs, their very presence became suspect. But the Crown's grip was not unchallenged. Beneath the surface, resentment smouldered. Catholic nobles who had conformed to English rule found themselves increasingly marginalized. The dispossessed fumed in silence. And then in 1641, the anger exploded. It began with whispers, then skirmishes, and then full rebellion. Irish Catholic nobles, frustrated by decades of plantation and persecution, rose up in a coordinated uprising. Their aim was to reclaim land, protect their faith, and restore some measure of self-rule. But what followed spiraled into chaos. The rebellion quickly spread across Ulster and beyond. Protestant settlers were attacked, hundreds were killed. Stories of massacres, some true, some exaggerated, spread like wildfire in England and Scotland. The fear turned into rage, and in London a new kind of leader was watching. His name was Oliver Cromwell. By 1649, England had undergone its own revolution. The king had been tried and executed. The monarchy was gone. In its place, a Puritan-led republic led by Cromwell himself. A man of fierce conviction and cold efficiency, Cromwell saw Ireland not just as a military problem but as a divine mission. The island was a nest of Catholic rebellion, a threat to the new Protestant order, and, in his eyes, a land of heresy that had to be cleansed. Cromwell landed in Ireland that same year with a well-trained army and a ruthless strategy. His first target was Drogheda, a walled town north of Dublin held by Irish Confederate and Royalist forces. The siege was brief. When the town fell, Cromwell gave no quarter. His troops massacred the garrison, over 2,000 men, and then turned on civilians. Priests were butchered. Church doors ran red. It was a warning. Next came Wexford, another massacre, more slaughter. Cromwell justified it all as the will of God. By the righteous judgment of God they were brought to ruin, he wrote. But for the Irish it was not justice, it was terror. Over the next year, town after town fell. Some surrendered and were spared, others resisted and were destroyed. The countryside burned, crops were seized or destroyed, cattle driven off, entire populations were displaced. And when the killing stopped, the famine began. By 1653 the war was over. Cromwell's campaign had crushed all resistance, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands were dead, killed in battle, murdered in reprisals, or starved in the aftermath. Ireland's population dropped by as much as a third. It was not merely a conquest, it was a cataclysm. And then came the punishment. Land was confiscated on a scale never seen before. Catholic landowners, even those who had stayed neutral, were dispossessed. A new wave of English Protestants were brought in to settle the fertile lands of Leinster and Munster. Those Irish who remained were driven west, beyond the River Shannon, into the rocky, poorer lands of Connaught. To hell or to Connaught, the saying went. For many, it felt like both. Cromwell's rule didn't last. He died in 1658, and the monarchy was restored soon after. But the damage was done. The demographic, religious, and political map of Ireland had been violently redrawn. The Catholic majority now found itself landless, voiceless, and powerless. A Protestant ascendancy was beginning to emerge, a class of landlords, soldiers, and officials who controlled wealth, law, and politics. The old Gaelic world was not only broken, it was buried. What little remained existed in secret. Catholic masses were held in the woods or at dawn in hidden valleys. Irish poetry became a language of mourning, songs of exile, of betrayal, of vanished glory. Families who once traced their lineage to kings now worked as tenants or labourers on land they once ruled. Yet even amid this devastation, the spirit of Ireland endured. The faith remained. So did the language, the stories, the deep memory of what had been lost. But the world had changed. The plantations had created a new ruling class. Cromwell had shattered the old order. Ireland was no longer simply a conquered land. It was a wounded one. A land haunted not only by the past, but by what might have been. The 17th century had opened with hope among the Gaelic lords that they might find a way to coexist with the crown. It ended with the brutal realization that such dreams were over. The question now was not whether Ireland could remain Irish, but whether the Irish themselves could survive what came next, because the pain of the 17th century was not an end, it was a prelude, and the struggle for Ireland, its land, its soul, its future, was far from finished. Chapter 9. Penal Laws and the Fight to Survive. Ireland emerged from the 17th century not as a land defeated, but as one deliberately broken. The plantations had scattered the native Irish, Cromwell's campaign had drowned the land in blood, and what followed was not peace, but punishment. The wounds of war were deep, but the decades that followed would etch those wounds into law. What fire and famine had begun, policy would complete. For the Irish Catholic majority, survival would now mean silence. The battlefield had shifted from open rebellion to the quiet struggle of endurance. This was the era of the penal laws. The name sounds sterile. Penal laws, like legal footnotes lost in dusty archives. But for those who lived through them, they were something far more cruel, the codification of humiliation. A long list of restrictions, rules and punishments designed not only to weaken Irish Catholics, but to erase them, slowly, legally, permanently. By the end of the 17th century, the Protestant ascendancy had solidified its grip on Ireland. Land ownership, once split between Norman Irish lords and native Gaelic chieftains, was now almost entirely in the hands of the Protestant minority. They controlled Parliament, the courts, the army, and the Church of Ireland. Catholics, though still the overwhelming majority in numbers, had been reduced to tenants, labourers, and shadows in their own homeland. To make sure they stayed that way, the penal laws were introduced. The logic was clear: keep the Irish poor, voiceless, and divided, and they would never rise again. The laws touched every corner of life. Catholics could not vote, they could not sit in Parliament, they could not serve in the army, the navy, or the judiciary. They were barred from becoming lawyers, schoolteachers, or public officials. Their religion was tolerated only in name, not in practice. Catholic clergy were banned, hunted, and exiled. Bishops were driven underground or forced to flee abroad. Mass was outlawed in public, and Catholic education was forbidden entirely. The consequences were devastating. A Catholic parent could not legally send their child to school, nor could they inherit land equally. In fact, if a Catholic landowner died, his estate was forcibly divided among all sons unless one converted to Protestantism, at which point he could inherit the entire estate alone. The law didn't just penalize faith, it rewarded betrayal. Loyalty to family, to faith, to memory, these were now legal liabilities. But the Irish did not vanish. They adapted. In the hills and fields, Mass was still said, quietly, before dawn, in secret. Priests wandered the countryside in disguise, moving from parish to parish like hunted men. In valleys, forests, and ruined abbeys, mass rocks were hidden, simple stone altars used for forbidden ceremonies. Word would spread quietly. A priest was coming. A wedding, a funeral, a baptism would take place at night, under the stars, far from the eyes of landlords and magistrates. And while Catholic schools were illegal, they existed all the same. They were called hedge schools, a name born of necessity. Taught behind hedges, in barns, or under trees, these informal schools preserved not just the basics of reading and writing, but the soul of a people. The Irish language was spoken there. Irish poetry was recited. History, outlawed and twisted by official accounts, was passed down the old way, by word of mouth. The hedge schoolmasters were often wandering scholars themselves, poor, underpaid, but revered. Their students were barefoot, often hungry, and many never learned to read English, but they learned who they were. They learned that Brian Boru had once stood against the Norse, that the flight of the earls had marked a tragedy, that Cromwell had left the land in ruin. They learned, even in whispers, that their grandparents had spoken a tongue older than Parliament, older than English law. The penal laws didn't stop culture, they forced it underground. And in that darkness, Irish identity was reshaped. Once a proud warrior culture based on clan, lineage, and land, it became a culture of resistance, resilience, and endurance. The harp, once played in royal halls, now became a symbol of loss. The old sagas, once sung by court poets, were now remembered in fragments and songs. The Irish language, still spoken in most rural areas, was slowly being edged out of towns and courts, replaced by English through law and pressure. Yet it lived on, in lullabies, in curses, in prayers, spoken over the dying. But not all resistance was silent. There were pockets of rebellion. Small uprisings, some planned, others spontaneous, broke out from time to time. None succeeded. Many were crushed with brutal swiftness. The memory of Cromwell and the failed rebellions of the past hung heavy. Too much had been lost already. Now most Irish people chose a quieter form of defiance, to endure. And endure they did. Across the sea, in England, Ireland was seen as a sullen, dangerous place. Its people were backward, superstitious, uncivilized. The press mocked the Irish peasant, the Catholic priest, the papist rituals. But what the English did not understand, perhaps could never understand, was that this so-called backwardness was not ignorance. It was memory, a memory that refused to die. In exile, Irish clergy founded colleges in France, Spain, and Rome. There, future priests trained to return home in secret. They brought with them books, news, and hope. Irish merchants abroad formed networks to support families back home. Emigrants in Catholic Europe found work in armies, courts, and even monasteries. They carried their accents, their pride, and their grief with them wherever they went. And within Ireland, the division between Protestant and Catholic deepened, but so too did class lines. Many Protestants were poor, tenant farmers no better off than their Catholic neighbours. But the law was clear, religion was the boundary. And so even in poverty, Protestants had a path to power, while Catholics had none. The ascendancy, that small ruling elite of landlords and politicians, used the penal laws not just to control, but to divide. The 18th century in Ireland was not marked by grand wars or spectacular events. It was an age of waiting. A century of quiet suffering, whispered stories, and survival. But even silence leaves traces. The ruins of abbeys still stood, covered in ivy, but remembered. The mass rocks were kept clean. The hedge schoolmasters taught a language the law tried to kill. And in homes across the island, candles were lit on Christmas Eve, not for decoration, but to signal to the passing priest that this was a Catholic home and that he was welcome. The penal laws were not always evenly enforced. In some regions they were applied harshly. In others, local landlords turned a blind eye. But the threat of enforcement always lingered. That was their true power, not in the arrests they caused, but in the fear they created. By the late 1700s, cracks began to show. Enlightenment ideas swept across Europe. In America, colonies rebelled. In France, the king lost his head. Even in England, voices began to question the morality of ruling an island through exclusion and fear. A slow, uneven process of reform began. Some penal laws were softened. Catholic merchants gained limited rights. Some Catholic landowners recovered property. But the core injustice remained. The Catholic majority had no power, no voice, no place in the shaping of their own nation. Yet even this slow thaw gave rise to new movements. Irish identity began to reassert itself, not just as a Catholic memory, but as a political force. A new generation of thinkers, writers, and orators began to dream, not of restoring the past, but of building a future. They had seen what suffering had done. Now they would seek to turn that suffering into strength. But that moment had not yet arrived, for now Ireland remained a land of hushed prayers, coded stories, and closed mouths, a place where children learned their alphabet beside a hedge, where priests moved by moonlight, and where a conquered people clung not to power, but to memory. And sometimes that is enough, because memory, once kept alive long enough, can become hope, and hope, even in silence, can begin to speak. Chapter 10. Famine, Exodus, and the Irish Diaspora. By the early 19th century, Ireland was a wounded country still trying to find its breath. The penal laws had begun to loosen, but the damage they left behind was carved into the structure of Irish society. The Protestant ascendancy remained dominant. Land ownership still lay almost entirely in the hands of a small, largely English-descended elite. The Irish Catholic majority were tenants on land they did not own, subject to rents they could not control, governed from a foreign parliament that did not speak for them. But the people endured, just as they always had. They endured through poetry, through music, through language, through faith, and through the earth itself, because no matter how many laws or landlords tried to claim the land, the land still fed them, or so they believed. In the bogs, in the hills, in the small scattered plots across the countryside, a humble tuber had become the cornerstone of Irish survival. The potato. It was not native to Ireland, but by the 1800s it had become synonymous with Irish peasant life. It grew in poor soil, yielded a high-calorie return, and could feed a family with only a tiny patch of land. Entire generations grew up on potatoes, lived on potatoes, and knew nothing else. A single crop fed millions. But that dependence was a trap, because when the crop failed, there was nothing else. In 1845, a strange rot was noticed in the fields. Potatoes that looked healthy above ground turned to black slime when dug up. Entire rows collapsed. What came to be known as Phytophthora infestans, or potato blight, had arrived, carried, most likely, by ships from the Americas. It spread fast. In weeks, the blight reached every corner of Ireland. And then it came back the next year, and the next. For 5 years, the crop that had kept a nation alive turned into poison. The Great Hunger had begun. At first, the government in London treated it as a local crisis. Some aid was offered, soup kitchens were opened, public works schemes were set up, paying desperate men to build roads to nowhere, walls with no purpose, bridges that led across empty fields. But it was never enough. Bureaucracy moved slowly. Political ideology moved even slower. The prevailing belief in laissez-faire economics held that the market would correct itself, that interfering with food supply would only prolong the crisis. But the market did not care for starving children. The market did not bury the dead. What made the famine so cruel was not only the blight itself, but the abundance that surrounded it. Ireland, even in the worst years, continued to export food. Grain, beef, butter, all left the ports under guard, shipped to England while Irish families starved in their cottages. The best land was used not for feeding the hungry, but for profit. British landlords, many of whom never set foot in Ireland, collected their rents without pity. If a tenant could not pay, he was evicted. And if he resisted, the thatch roof was burned, the walls pulled down, the family left to die in the ditch. Entire villages vanished, roads filled with the walking dead, hollow-eyed mothers carrying limp children, barefoot men searching for work, grandparents collapsing in fields. Diseases spread quickly, typhus, cholera, dysentery. Death was not always swift. Sometimes it came with fever, sometimes it came in silence. Coffins became a luxury. In some areas, bodies were buried in mass graves, without names, without prayers, without a single mourner left strong enough to cry. The worst year was 1847, known in folk memory as Black 47. That winter, the frost came early, and the soup kitchens shut down. The fields were empty. The workhouses were full. People died with grass in their mouths, hoping it might fill the ache inside. 1 million people perished during the famine, dead from hunger, disease, or despair. But the famine did not just take the dead, it stole the living. From the ashes of the hunger rose an exodus, a tidal wave of emigration that reshaped not only Ireland but the world. Those who could escape did, any way they could. Families sold everything for a passage across the sea. Children were put on boats alone, clutching letters and prayers. Whole communities walked to the ports and vanished. They boarded what came to be known as coffin ships, cramped, disease-ridden vessels where death followed them across the ocean. Some never made it. Those who did found themselves in strange cities with strange accents and no home to return to. America became the promised land, though it offered no miracles. Irish immigrants arrived in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, hungry, poor, Catholic, and unwanted. They were met with suspicion, hatred, and exploitation. No Irish need apply signs hung in shop windows. They were crowded into slums, forced to take the lowest jobs, mocked in newspapers, accused of being drunkards and criminals. But they came in waves, millions of them, and they endured. In the decades after the famine, over 2 million people left Ireland. Some went to America, others to Canada, Australia, or Britain. The diaspora had begun not as a proud spreading of culture, but as a desperate scattering of survivors. Ireland lost not just a generation, but a future. The language declined, the old ways faded, whole regions became ghostlands. In the west, you could walk for miles and hear only the wind. But across the sea, in the cities and coal mines and factories of the New World, the Irish built something new. They formed communities, built churches, organized labor unions, entered politics. They became policemen, soldiers, nurses, mayors. They carried Ireland with them, in their accents, in their churches, in the music they played and the stories they told. And they never forgot what drove them away. Back home, Ireland had changed. It was now a land of absence. Families told stories of brothers who had gone to Boston and never wrote back, of cousins who drowned on the voyage, of daughters who married strangers in foreign parishes. Names changed forever. The land itself remembered. Empty cottages stood with doors swinging in the wind. Overgrown paths led to vanished villages. Graves had no visitors. The famine was not just a tragedy, it was a fracture. A turning point so deep that even today it lingers. In population statistics, in family trees, in songs that always end in minor keys, in the silence that follows when someone asks what happened to great-grandfather's brother, or why no one speaks Irish anymore. Yet out of that loss came something else, an awakening. In the decades that followed, the Irish abroad began to organize. They formed political movements, sent money home, supported causes of freedom and reform. The seeds of later revolution were sown not just in Dublin, but in the tenements of New York and the neighborhoods of Chicago. The diaspora, though scattered, remained bound by memory. And within Ireland itself, something stirred. The famine had shown that loyalty to the crown meant nothing in the face of starvation, that charity could not replace justice, that survival required more than prayer. The old myths of faithful obedience were gone. What replaced them was slower, more dangerous, a rising anger, quiet and cold. The Irish language, though wounded, found new champions. Nationalist movements began to speak not just of protest, but of independence. The land issue became political, not just personal. Writers, poets, and musicians began to recover what had been buried. A cultural revival began to flicker in the ashes. The pain of the famine did not create this revival, but it reminded the Irish that no one else would fight for their survival. They would have to do it themselves. The Great Hunger had left scars, deep, invisible ones, but scars, by their nature, are signs that the wound has closed, that the body, though damaged, refused to die. Ireland had been emptied, but it had not been erased, and as the 19th century marched toward its end, a new generation was rising, one that remembered both the loss and the longing, one that would not beg for crumbs, but would one day demand a nation. Chapter 11. Rebellion, Rising, and the Road to Independence. Ireland had been scarred by hunger, emptied by exile, and suffocated under centuries of foreign rule, but beneath the silence that followed the Great Famine, the air still trembled with defiance. The fields might have been quiet, the villages half empty, but in parlours, pubs, and printing presses, the idea of Ireland, free, proud, and whole, had never truly died. And it was in that silence, in that aching absence, left by the dead and departed, that the seeds of rebellion took root once more. In 1798, long before the famine, and long before the world knew the name Michael Collins, a Protestant barrister named Theobald Wolfe Tone tried to do what few had dared, unite Catholic and Protestant, Gaelic and planter, under one banner of Irish republicanism. Influenced by the revolutions in France and America, Wolfe Tone helped found the United Irishmen, a secret society bent on ending British rule and establishing an Irish republic. His dream was simple and radical, that all Irish people, regardless of creed, would rise as one. That summer they tried. The rebellion of 1798 erupted in several counties, Wexford, Antrim, Down, but it lacked coordination, arms, and, crucially, French reinforcements. The uprising was crushed with terrifying speed. Atrocities were committed on both sides. Villages burned. Rebels were executed en masse. Wolfe Tone himself was captured, tried, and, before the noose could claim him, died by his own hand in prison. He was 35, but his words did not die. "To break the connection with England," he had written, "the never-failing source of all our political evils." That line became a spark passed down through generations. Tone became a martyr. His rebellion, a failure in practice, succeeded in legend. And that legend would grow. Through the 19th century, rebellion after rebellion flickered to life and was snuffed out. The young Irelanders in 1848, inspired by European revolutions, rose up and failed. The Fenians tried again in the 1860s, planning raids from both Ireland and America. The British crushed them too, but every failed rising left a name, a ballad, a grave, and a lesson. If force alone could not win freedom, perhaps memory could keep the fire alive long enough for the next attempt to succeed. In the meantime, the Irish people began to shift their strategy. The land war of the late 1800s, led by men like Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell, focused not on political independence, but on reclaiming the soil itself. Tenant farmers refused to pay unfair rents, resisted eviction, and demanded land reform. It worked. Over decades, laws were passed that allowed Irish tenants to buy the land they worked. Slowly, the land began to return to Irish hands, not by sword, but by strategy. Alongside this movement, the cultural revival began. The Gaelic League was founded to preserve and promote the Irish language. Writers and poets embraced Celtic myths. Schools taught Irish history again. A generation raised on the memory of famine and forced silence began to rediscover its voice. By the early 20th century, that voice became political. Sinn Féin, founded in 1905, emerged as a party advocating for Irish self-government. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, a secret revolutionary organization, plotted behind the scenes. And when World War I erupted in 1914, many Irishmen joined the British Army, hoping that loyalty in war might earn Ireland a measure of freedom afterward. But others saw the war as an opportunity to strike, and so in 1916, on an April Monday when the streets of Dublin were still, a group of poets, teachers and dreamers walked into the General Post Office, raised a green flag and declared an Irish Republic. The Easter Rising had begun. The rebels were few, maybe 1,500 across the city, and their arms were limited. The British response was swift and merciless. For 6 days, Dublin became a battlefield. Artillery shelled the GPO. Civilians died in crossfire. The city centre was left in ruins. Eventually, the rebels surrendered. The rising, like so many before it, had failed. But what followed changed everything. The leaders of the rising were not executed in public, as the British had done in centuries past. They were taken in ones and twos to Kilmainham jail and shot in secret. Padraig Pearse, Thomas Clark, Joseph Plunkett, married in prison the night before he died. James Connolly, wounded, unable to stand, tied to a chair before they killed him. Each execution turned public opinion. Men once mocked as foolish idealists became martyrs. Their blood, like Wolfe Tone's, soaked the roots of revolution. In the years that followed, support for Irish independence surged. Sinn Féin swept the 1918 election. But instead of taking their seats in Westminster, the party's members formed their own parliament in Dublin, the Dáil Éireann, and declared independence once more. The British did not recognise the Dáil. The war began. The Irish War of Independence, from 1919 to 1921, was a guerrilla conflict. It was not fought in fields with rows of soldiers, but in alleyways, country lanes, and darkened doorways. The Irish Republican Army, led by Michael Collins, a revolutionary with the mind of a general and the heart of a pragmatist, waged war against the British Empire with ambushes, assassinations, and intelligence networks. The British responded with terror of their own. The Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, paramilitary forces sent from Britain, committed atrocities burning towns, killing civilians, intimidating communities. For every ambush, a reprisal. For every attack, a house burned. But the IRA kept fighting, and the people kept supporting them. By 1921, both sides were exhausted. The war had taken its toll. A truce was called, negotiations began, and then came the treaty. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed in December 1921, created the Irish Free State, a dominion within the British Empire, like Canada or Australia. It gave Ireland its own government, its own army, its own future. But it came at a price. The oath of allegiance to the British Crown remained. And most controversially of all, 6 counties in the north, where the Protestant Unionist population was strongest, were to remain under British rule. Ireland was free, but it was not whole. The treaty split the country. Some, like Collins, saw it as a stepping stone to full freedom. Others, like Eamon de Valera, saw it as a betrayal. The divisions hardened, friends became enemies, comrades turned on one another. In 1922, civil war broke out. The Irish Civil War was brutal, tragic, and short. Former brothers in arms fought each other with bitterness. The new Free State Army, led by Collins, fought the anti-treaty forces who believed the war should continue until Ireland was fully sovereign. Towns were bombarded, leaders were assassinated, and in August of 1922, Michael Collins himself was killed in an ambush in Cork, shot by former comrades, dying in the very country he helped create. By 1923, the Civil War ended. The Free State stood, bloodied but intact. Its leaders were divided, its people were weary, and its heart was broken in two. Ireland had finally gained a form of independence, but at the cost of unity. The island remained divided. The south would eventually become the Republic of Ireland. The north, Northern Ireland, would stay within the United Kingdom, a status that would lead to decades more of strife. But for the first time in centuries, Ireland governed itself. It spoke in its own voice, it buried its own dead, passed its own laws, and flew its own flag. And beneath that flag lay the bones of Wolfe Tone, of Pearse, of Connolly, of Collins, men who had died for a country that finally, painfully, had come into being. The road to independence had been long and merciless. It had passed through famine, rebellion, poetry, and betrayal. It had risen with hope and sunk with grief, but it had not ended, because the next chapter would begin in the shadows of Belfast, in the streets of Derry, in the cries of children and the songs of mothers. The struggle for Ireland, united, free, and at peace, was not over. It never really was. Chapter 12. The Troubles, the Peace, and a New Ireland. Ireland had won its freedom, but not its unity. When the Irish Free State was born in 1922, it left behind 6 counties in the north, Ulster's fractured heart, still tied to the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland, as it was now called, would remain a place apart. But what looked like a political compromise on paper would fester into a wound that refused to heal. Because within that small corner of the island, 2 identities collided, and neither would surrender easily. The Protestant Unionist majority in Northern Ireland saw themselves as British, loyal to the Crown, to the Union Jack, to the legacy of empire. The Catholic nationalist minority saw themselves as Irish, descendants of the dispossessed, loyal to Dublin, and dreaming of a united Ireland. The new state in the north was designed to favour the former. The Unionists held the power. The government, the police force, the civil service, almost entirely Protestant. Catholics were often shut out of jobs, housing, education. Gerrymandering ensured Unionist political dominance even where the numbers didn't. For decades, resentment simmered. Catholics protested discrimination, but their voices were often drowned out or ignored. The peace was uneasy, tense, fragile. Then, in the late 1960s, it broke. Inspired by the civil rights movements in America, Northern Ireland's Catholic communities began marching, demanding equal rights, fair treatment, dignity. The marches were peaceful at first, but the reaction was not. Police clashed with protesters, loyalist mobs attacked Catholic neighborhoods, Barricades were thrown up in cities like Derry and Belfast, and soon what began as protest turned into full-scale conflict. This was the beginning of the Troubles. The Irish Republican Army, long dormant, re-emerged with fury. Their aim was simple: end British rule in Northern Ireland and unite the island by force if necessary. In response, loyalist paramilitary groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force and Ulster Defence Association took up arms to defend the Union. The British Army was sent in to keep the peace, but soon became a target themselves. The violence spiraled: bombings, assassinations, riots, checkpoints, sniper fire. Entire neighbourhoods turned into war zones. The conflict claimed more than 3,500 lives over the next 3 decades. Many were civilians, caught in the crossfire or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were police, soldiers, paramilitaries. Fear was constant. A trip to the shop might end in an explosion. A wrong word could be a death sentence. Some moments became etched in national memory. Bloody Sunday, 1972. British soldiers opened fire on a peaceful civil rights march in Derry, killing 14 unarmed people. The footage shocked the world. So did the hunger strikes of 1981, when IRA prisoners in the Maze prison demanded to be treated as political prisoners rather than criminals. One of them, Bobby Sands, was elected to the British Parliament while still behind bars. He died after 66 days without food. 9 more followed. Their deaths turned them into martyrs, deepening the divide. Every attempt at peace seemed to falter. Ceasefires were broken, negotiations collapsed. The distrust ran too deep. One community mourned British soldiers, the other mourned IRA volunteers. One called it terrorism, the other called it resistance. And for the ordinary people, Catholic and Protestant alike, it meant years of fear, loss, and uncertainty. Families were torn apart. Children grew up behind walls. Belfast became a city of murals, fences, and silence. But change was coming. By the 1990s, the fatigue of endless violence had taken its toll. Behind the scenes, political leaders and community figures on both sides began to talk. Quietly, carefully. The British and Irish governments, too, knew that the cycle had to be broken. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. But in 1998, after years of diplomacy, compromise, and pressure, the impossible happened. On April 10, 1998, Good Friday, a peace agreement was signed. The Good Friday Agreement, or Belfast Agreement, was a masterpiece of ambiguity and balance. It created a devolved government for Northern Ireland, where power would be shared between Unionists and nationalists. It established cross-border institutions between the North and the Republic of Ireland. It recognised the right of people in Northern Ireland to identify as British, Irish, or both. It laid out a path to a united Ireland, should a majority ever vote for it. And it committed all parties to peaceful, democratic methods. The IRA agreed to decommission its weapons. Loyalist groups did the same. British troops began withdrawing. Political prisoners were released. The people voted, North and South, and overwhelmingly approved the deal. It was a moment of cautious hope. A handshake in a hall, a flag lowered, a gun buried, but peace is not the same as unity. Northern Ireland remained deeply divided. Schools, neighbourhoods, even sports teams were often separated by community. Political tensions remained. The past could not be erased overnight. Some rejected the agreement as a betrayal. Others saw it as a beginning. And yet, slowly, something began to change. Walls were painted over, barricades came down. Young people, who had grown up during the Troubles, now spoke of careers, travel, and art instead of blood and fear. A new generation was rising, one shaped by the memory of violence, but not defined by it. In the Republic of Ireland, the change was no less dramatic. The same country that had once been synonymous with poverty, emigration, and silence was now reimagining itself. Ireland joined the European Economic Community in 1973, but it was in the 1990s and 2000s that it truly transformed. A booming economy, nicknamed the Celtic Tiger, brought foreign investment, jobs, and confidence. Dublin became a hub for global tech companies. Ireland became one of the fastest-growing economies in Europe. Roads improved, cities expanded. A nation that had once sent its children abroad to find work now welcomed newcomers from around the world. Social change followed. In the space of a single generation, Ireland transformed from a deeply conservative Catholic society into one of Europe's most progressive nations. Divorce was legalized. Same-sex marriage was approved by public vote. A new openness emerged, one that questioned old certainties and embraced modernity without forgetting the past. Yet Ireland never stopped being Irish. The language, long endangered, found new life in schools, media, and music. Traditional music blended with modern beats. Festivals honored ancient saints and contemporary poets alike. The diaspora remained a part of the story. Millions of Irish Americans, Canadians, Australians, and others watching with pride as the homeland stood tall on the world stage. Ireland had known occupation, famine, rebellion, civil war, and terror. It had been mocked, dismissed, and wounded. But it had also endured. And it had changed. Not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. The border between North and South still exists, both politically and emotionally. Brexit in recent years raised new questions about trade, identity, sovereignty. But the Good Friday Agreement held. The peace, though imperfect, has lasted. And for most Irish people today, the future is something that can be planned, not feared. In Belfast, children now play where soldiers once marched. In Derry, tourists walk the walls once defended by guns. In Dublin, startups rise where once there was silence. In every county, the flag flies, not with the arrogance of empire, but with the quiet pride of survival. Ireland is no longer just a story of loss. It is a story of endurance, reinvention, and hope. And it continues still.